Welcome back to Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 94, part 3. This week in geopolitics, we're going to be discussing the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska and what it means for the European Union and the prospects of peace by following the money. And we'll take a look at the other conflicts in the world so that we can see how we progress this week so we can try and push forward. So what happened this week? Well, the headlines were dominated by the meeting in Alaska. That meeting was brokered and expected to be only between Putin and Trump, but it actually had a bunch more people there, more representative on both the Russian side and the US side. And at the end of it, you had some public comments from Putin, where he said a few things, and from Trump as well. So we'll go through that meeting, what it actually means, what was said. And it was followed up by another meeting. Right after the meeting or during the meeting, Trump said that Zelensky was also spoken with in a late night call after the meeting. So Trump spoke to Zelensky, and that was also done with many of the European leaders, including the NATO Secretary General as well. So all of the important players. This led to a meeting on Monday this week, which was after the Friday meeting last week, which was between the EU leaders, Zelensky, and that happened in the US as well. So obviously, Putin wasn't there because of the arrest warrant by the international criminal courts, the same one that Netanyahu is meant to be upheld to, but he gets to go to the US because of that hypocrisy for his crimes against humanity. So in the meeting on Monday, there was Zelensky, there was von der Leyen from the European Union. There was Merce, a puppet for the Proof of Weapons Network. All of these are puppets for the Proof of the Weapons Network. Zelensky, who represents the military-industrial complex, not the Ukrainian people. Von der Leyen, who also represents the Proof of Weapons Network, Merz from Germany, Macron from France, and Stubb from, I think, Finland, Mieloni from Italy, and of course Starmer from the UK, a big Proof of Weapons Network pundit, and Rutte from NATO, is that one? The United Nations as well. So prior to the meeting, Trump said that any failure to reach a peace deal with Putin would have economic implications. There was threat and posturing going into the meeting. And then after the meeting, he said he would likely prioritize buyers of Russian oil in terms of threatening people that buy Russian oil, including China. So there was threats at China if talks were going to be would fail. And now after the meeting, Trump said, "I don't think I have quote. I don't think I have to think of possible increase in tariffs on China after the meeting." So here were the initial takeaways from the meeting that I took away. It was pretty uneventful, and it was followed by two-way narratives. Those on the left were saying epic failure. Those on the right were saying epic victory. So you got the whole partisan thing. But let's take away a few of the things that were said. So Trump said the meeting with Putin was a 10 out of 10. Best meeting in the world. We're reshaping the world. You know, obviously taking the victory lap, even though virtually nothing of substance was announced. And then the second thing is Trump says that one of the two significant items remain unresolved. So it was making out like pieces around the corner, but there's one or two of the significant items that haven't been resolved. Trump says that Zelensky will visit US on Monday. So that was the meeting that did happen. And then Zelensky said that he had a 90-minute call with Trump. So that was confirmed as well. Zelensky said that Ukraine is ready for, constructive cooperation. Zelensky notes that there were positive signals from the US on security guarantees. Also, there was no comment from Putin or the Kremlin so far, confirming whether there would be a peace deal. Putin confirmed that war would not have, this one Trump loved. Putin confirmed that war may not have happened under Trump as it did for Biden. So obviously Trump's big win has always been to say this war would never have happened under me. This was a Biden war and I inherited it. And obviously his campaign promise was to resolve it within 24 hours. When he didn't resolve it within 24 hours, he said he'd resolve it within 100 days as per the Kellogg plan. When it wasn't resolved under 100 days, we get these further walk back from that. Of course, it was Biden's fault, and I just inherited this as well, which is an element of truth, but we know this is unipolar. The governments aren't the decision makers. This is the proof of weapons network. They engineered the NATO expansion. They did the military coup via the CIA in 2014. They did NATO expansion, and they did the escalation of the war that led to the invasion of Ukraine. I don't call it a special military operation. This was no doubt an invasion, but this was based upon breaches of NATO expansion, just as if there was expansion by China or Russia in Mexico, it would lead to the exact same situation. But this was a war for the proof of weapons network to vassalize Ukraine and Europe, make sure that European Union was dependent upon America in order to allow BlackRock to purchase more and more assets on the cheap for the proof of weapons network. So now the European Union has a basically 47.60 cap on Russian oil prices, which means that they don't want, it helps China basically, but the European Union has those oil caps, and they're trying to make sure that the oil is coming from America, and the natural gas side, which is why Nord Stream pipeline suddenly blew up. But removing this cap, if we were to look at the impact, imagine the negotiations led to the removing of this cap, that would likely send oil below $50. And that can have an impact on inflation. And so while we're moving, as we covered in the macro section, to this post 3% environment and increasing inflation, if you could get peace, then it could lead to a decrease in the oil prices, and that would be relieve some of the inflationary pressures as well. And so in anticipation of peace deal, the market kind of had a correction in the oil price. So it was speculating on whether peace would happen. I covered in all of my coverage of this that I don't expect it to happen. Why? Because we follow the money, and we know there's a lot more money to be made in war. And this is part of the BlackRock vassalization strategy that I personally believe leads to Russia gaining more and more territory and more land, while Ukraine is forced into negotiations with the proof of weapons network for wheat, oil, rare earth minerals, and various other things. And Europe is going to get weaker and weaker and weaker. And this strategy is working. BlackRock's getting what they want. Vassalization strategy is working perfectly. Russia's getting what they want. And so there's no incentive to this move towards peace, because there's lots more money to be made by the proof of weapons network at the expense of the European, average American, and Brit as well. And so if a peace deal did happen as well, wheat prices could fall to basically a 5-year low. There was big inflation, food price inflation, plus oil price inflation, and oil produces, is the input cost of all the producers, all of the trucker industry. And so obviously as the producer price index goes up, that can lead to consumer price index of goods as well. Ukraine exports grains to essentially nearly 400 million people worldwide. So if that was able to be turned back on, that could have an impact on wheat prices. Food inflation has been a real problem, and it's been really elevated as a result of the Russian invasion as well. because that led to declining Ukrainian grain exports. So the market was speculating around peace and the prospect of wheat prices coming down during the war, or the prices that went up during the war, sorry. And so according to the Fed put out a couple of announcements as well. They said that the war added up to 2% to global inflation. So in an environment of 3%, this could correct it down to 1%. That ties into many of the things we were talking about in the macro section, which is why I saw zero prospects of peace from both the financial industrial complex, the technical industrial complex, and the military industrial complex departments of the proof of weapons network. But if it were to lead to the reversal of sanctions on Russia, we would see one of the, basically, Russia's one of the most sanctioned countries with Iran in the world. And so it would be very stimulative to the economy. It would combat oil price inflation, and we'd expect the market to see that. Now, the bond market was pricing in speculation on this leading to peace. The oil market and the wheat market were all doing that as well. So the market was telling us that this might lead to peace. But me following the money, I think that was market manipulation, because those really in the know that there's no prospect of peace. I would be very surprised if this actually did lead to peace, because of all the monetary reason and the power dynamic game that I covered earlier. It would also expect, if we did move to peace, that Ukraine would ramp up exports. And so global inflation would likely, fall to 100 basis points. The market basically started to really price in this potential peace agreement. And then it corrected for approximately 5 days after the meeting. And then based upon the Fed meeting, we had a bit of a correction today. So it was all in line with kind of other types of market forces as well. Ukrainian bonds, they jumped up sharply since the Alaska meeting. And so, since that meeting was announced, the cost to the bonds price came up. And so the rates were factoring in the inverse as well, that they may be moving towards peace. Basically, Trump was meant to be backing a deal with Russia to have Russia have full control of Donbass, and that was going to be in exchange for complete peace with Ukraine, which obviously Russia has always said the three things that are important to them in getting towards that, and that doesn't get towards that. So I think we've got another merry-go-round of distraction, market manipulation, false hopes, and a big lose that in the end weakens the dollar, which is the strategic goal, I believe, of this. Eventually, Trump may get what he wants, but this one is incredibly hard because this is a genuine battle between a sovereign country, Russia, and the proof of weapons network that BlackRock does not control. And so this is all about a real battle, territorial battle between the sovereignty of Russia. Ukraine is a vassalized state for the proof of weapons network, and the military industrial complex event that will eventually lead to financial industrial complex and technical industrial complex rebuilding once they've exhausted all the profits for the military industrial complex. So as part of the agreement that was floated out there, Trump's easier, he's more blatant about it. It said that Ukraine will promise to buy $100 billion of American weapons, which will be financed by Europe. So the European Central Bank will print it. NATO budget increases. That's weapons. They get their GDP print. They get their growth. And this may be financed through some in-depth financial complex as well. UK has kind of been the piggy bank through the International Monetary Fund, and the International Monetary Fund is, one of the largest creditors that Ukraine owes money to as well. And that would lead to US security guarantees. So basically, they say security guarantees means Europe print money, create inflation for your people, buy more weapons from us, and then we get to negotiate deals for our companies. And that's what essentially the deal looks like when you follow the money. So my analysis, as I've been covering for the long term in Bitcoin Hard Talk, is this would be very good for US corporations, disastrous for Europe, and that was always the goal. That's why Nord Stream pipeline blew up. That's why NATO and covert wars happened, in order to get the aggression. And America and Europe were always meant to have Europe vassalized into America, American corporations vassalize more of, more of America. And the proof of weapons network benefit, which creates inflationary forces and the destruction of the European economy so it can be purchased for pennies on the dollar. So great for American companies, bad for Americans, disaster for the European Union all around, great for BlackRock, great for the vassalization project. And it's really not about peace. It was all about deal making. It was not about peace. So the narrative is defending democracy, Putin is Hitler, all of that different stuff. But this is just straight up proof of weapons network 101 strategy. It's about money. So follow the money and you don't need to be fools. There was announcements as well. It says Ukraine has been completely destroyed in terms of some of the oil pipelines. And so this happened during the negotiations. So the transfer of oil from Russia to Europe has been now suspended indefinitely, allegedly. But there is also the trade routes that are still happening as well with the LNG. But just to put some of the numbers to it, between 2020 and 2024, US weapons exported to EU tripled. And so leading up to the 2022 invasion, it was almost as if it was known to be happening. After the invasion, 2022 to 2024, this was a tripling of the purchases of weapons that happened between 2015 and 2019. 2014 was when the US executed the CIA operation and the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. And then leading up to 2019 is when Zelensky was installed as a puppet government for the proof of weapons network with a mission to get as much money as possible for weapons sales and fight till the last Ukrainian in a war they could never win that would weaken Europe and end up giving more territorial gain to Russia and strengthen BRICS. Classic BlackRock portfolio strategy. Basically, this completely boosts the demand for arms in Ukraine. That is funded by the IMF, UK economy, excessive debt, and is guaranteed by the land. So now the US holds 43% of the global arms exports, with approximately 35% going to the European Union in that period. So this is a US proof of weapons network game, and EU is paying the bill. 2024 US arms transfers, they hit $117.9 billion from foreign military sales alone to the US proof of weapons network. And that was a 45.7% increase. So the cycle of the war absolutely benefits the US military industrial complex while decapitating European stockpiles so that they're strategically weakened in order to spend more and increase their NATO budget, and makes Europe not independent with a bunch of puppet governments based upon political interference to usher in the spending of this money. And that's why everyone's angry with their leaders in Europe. That's why everyone's angry with their leaders in the UK. So all of the leaders across the European Union, they're pretty much US proof of weapons network puppets. I mean, in 2024, we had the Biden administration. They highlighted the Russian TikTok interference leading up to the the basically Romanian selected puppet government and the president, which was Runov. So this is basically a US-backed coup in a neo environment to basically block any anti-NATO type of forces or any type of candidates that would stand against that. Like, let me make sure I get the name wrong. Kalin Georgescu. Sorry if I got that name wrong. Which especially had some suspiciously timed leaks in order to make sure that the US puppet got in. There was meddling in France and Germany. In France cases, there was the 2024 basically snap elections that all of a sudden happened. We had the snap elections in UK as well. US officials funded the pro-Ukrainian movement. We had USAID funding that was exposed to Ukrainian media. We had the interference in the French elections against any type of, anti-Russia campaigns and various other things. Macron was the selected candidate. Many people have exposed his compromises, his strange background, many of the relationship with his wife, all sorts of stuff that have been covered. I'm not going to go there right now. In Germany, there was basically the US pressure via the Atlantic Council that interfered in the coalition talks. And this is when we had, the German leadership, the ones that are more aligned on an anti-China policy, sanctions, and the energy policy that led to the turning off of the nuclear energy, which destroyed Germany, which destroyed Europe, which led to this predatory EU-US deal for BlackRock portfolio companies, the decoupling of European Union and Germany from Russia and the cheap gas that was required in order to facilitate that. And under US pressure, the EU basically adopted many of the anti-China policies, which stopped them getting access to the cheap goods. As they Washington entered into the trade war. And this is forcing many of the de-risking and sanctions at the expense of the European economy, which is full vassalization, full puppet governments. Basically now the European Union officials fear, or they're giving out different narratives that they fear rivalry that would turn European into a battleground if they don't do what US says. And by US, I mean vassalized by the proof of weapons network. And the proof of weapons mafia is essentially threatening escalations through financial warfare if NATO and America don't put up the cash, and Europe can become an expanded battleground. If they don't divert trade away from China, away from Russia, and over to America, which completely destroys and harms the European economy, so that BlackRock can purchase assets for pennies on the dollar and force privatization over nationalized assets. And there's no concept of sovereignty or nationalism at all. If they want a really strategic weaken, I've talked in the past about the destabilization campaigns of open borders, fueling narratives of pro-nationalism, far-right, white supremacy narratives at the same time as fueling Muslim invasion narratives, at the same time as funding pro-immigration, anti-immigration, mass deportation, rival up the religious, racial narratives so that you can get the destabilization campaigns and usher in the surveillance state and police state of the technical industrial complex. That is coming to America, by the way, beta tested on UK and Europe. So in 2024, the US was basically the largest partner for European Union goods exports, 20.6%, with $319 billion in service exports, but $109 billion deficit. So it's a market, and this is why we have this tariffs and this narrative. The EU's ripping us off, but we end up with just massive deals like we covered in the macro section. Apparently, 5.2 million EU jobs, which is 2.4% of the total, depend upon US exports. And so after 2022, US energy surpluses grew. This is locking in a massive dependency. And so US's corporations and the proof of weapons network are absolutely the beneficiary of this. The projections are saying that by 2028, the EU will purchase the $750 billion. We covered more of this in the macro section, in US energy, and $600 billion in investments under the 2025 tariff deal that Trump and trade deal that Trump announced this week. There's problems with that right now, but essentially that's how these deals worked out when you have no sovereignty. I always get the comments of people saying it's sovereignty, not sovereignty. My mouth always wants to say sovereignty. So essentially, US corporations drain European resources, talent, and any autonomy. And any of these battles against Russia and China, Europe is a tool. And then the narrative is that Europe is a bad partner ripping off America. When you follow the money, when you understand the proof of weapons network, when you understand strategic investment equals control, when you understand vassalization, when you understand the deep state and the tactics and the profits of war, you just get the exact opposite of everything that's being told. So speaking of exact opposites, let's cover the final battle, because we know the reason I believe we can't have peace right now is because the Middle Eastern side, I believe, is going through the next phase of rebuild and financial industrial complex and technical industrial complex instead of military industrial complex, because the proof of weapons network needs to make up for the lost profits in Europe. So in the Middle Eastern side, while it looks like chaos, I'm seeing unification on a scale that we haven't seen before, but also I covered last week all the things that are happening to Israel and in the region that never, ever would have been able to happen before. So let's take a little bit of a look at what things have happened update. So So the traditional role of Israel, as a recap, or those new, is that it's always served as a conduit for US military industrial complex funding. Now, most people would say America doesn't benefit because they think of America as nationalism and the people. But America, as you know, is vassalized into the proof of weapons network and US corporations. And so the role of using Israel as a tool to funnel taxpayer money, printed, sent to Israel, and then the wars lead to massive contracts for US military corporations, is really been shifting over to Europe. That model is being applied in Europe, as I just covered. The global economic power dynamics, I believe, have fundamentally changed within the Middle East. And so I believe the US proof of weapons network, by following the money, is abandoning its old nationalistic model and ideology frameworks and replacing it with global frameworks headed up by BlackRock that wants to negotiate with Gulf countries that have the money so that they can invest in the global South that has the demographics and the children, basically because the birth rates are plundering in Europe, UK, Israel, America as well. And so they have to turn to the global south. And so US becomes the host country for the capital markets, but it becomes vassalized, as I've covered many, many times. So this includes the traditional military-industrial complex model for the Middle East, which was to fund Israel, perpetuate the Zionist ideology, and cover up for Israel so that it looked like it was a safe place for the Jews so that they could recruit an army that would then engage in the ethnic cleansing and the complete destabilization of the region and profit from forever wars and stopping the Middle East from unifying and competing with America as a global hegemon strategy. And so what I believe is happening, as I said, is we're moving to those lost profits are now going to be for the rebuild, financial industrial complex, and surveillance, technical industrial complex. But they're competing against sovereign deal and the various Saudi deals that are happening as well. But now I think the Middle East is moving towards decolonization by aligning with BlackRock and the proof of weapons network, by aligning with finance side and being able to go through a financial industrial complex agenda. That it marks the end of what I call the post-World War II era, the petrodollar, the death, destruction, violence, funding, militias, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Zionism, all these different Western funding and destabilization campaigns. And that also marks the end of Israel being a good investment for the proof of weapons network. And so that was the military industrial complex model was heavily reliant upon Israel. So in order to make that transition, remember the proof of weapons network is not a monolith. It's different competing powers that invest in each other. The military companies also hold shares in the financial companies and banks so they can hedge, but they also want as much profit to be squeezed in order to meet their goals and drop as many bombs as possible. So Israel's utility is basically, it used to be the pretext for stealing American taxpayer dollars and using it to pay for American weapons, which helped the companies. But you needed a narrative, a religious ideology, and Zionism was that perfect ideology. You could radicalize the evangelical Christians, you could demonize the Muslims as trying to attack, and you could radicalize Jewish Zionism into the trauma of the Christian Jewish, European Jewish and Christian battles of the past. So you could literally put them in Palestine, and you could have a settler colonial mission, and you could radicalize Jewish ideology and Zionism and conflate it with anti-Semitism and all the accusations for anyone that talked against it. And we've seen that. But that's now being exposed. Last week, I called the blame shift operations, where narratives that would never be allowed are now escaping. Now, you could interpret that as more freedom of speech, or you could interpret that as factions of the financial industrial complex fighting factions of the military industrial complex aligned with AIPAC and the military lobby, whereas the financial and technical lobby, and you have these competing strategic narratives that are pushing through with these covert operations. But it was never about bringing, it was always about bringing more money to the American corporations and economy. It was never about supporting the American people or working on a nationalist agenda. But those weapon sales have now essentially moved over to Europe, and they can be pushed into the Asia Pacific region by pushing the Taiwan is about to reunify or China invasion Taiwan narrative when it's ready. Too much to take on right now because America as hegemon can't handle multiple narratives. But the proof of weapons network can completely run all of the weapons in America to zero and get the rebuild contracts and then push to the next narrative as well. So order matters. So those contracts are all happening within Europe. And therefore, the military-industrial complex changes its strategic focus. And Operation Blame Shift is what I covered last week. And so Zionism is being turned into a toxic asset. America's becoming increasingly isolated by being the last to back Zionism. And Zionism is connected to the crimes against humanity and everything that we're seeing right now. And now, suddenly, even though the starvation campaign and the famine campaign was there all along, we're now getting strategic, I believe, financial industrial complex sponsored United Nations pushes of the truth. And so what did we have this week? So the famine was officially declared by Gaza by the United Nations backed IPC, which has a very good reputation. And now they're recognizing it, the very first famine in the Middle East. When it hits famine, it means it can go viral and mass genocide can become a reality. So what we knew all along, while they were trying to pretend they weren't doing it and pushing out narratives, it's now been confirmed for the very first time in the Middle East. The last time this was confirmed was in Sudan in North Africa. And that was a genuine famine based upon poverty, but also political interference. But this is being classified as man-made by Israel. By Israel. That wouldn't have been allowed to be talked about before. Also, there was a leak from the Israeli Defense Force that showed the statistics of the crimes against humanity that were being committed. So all of those narratives on Piers Morgan saying we're the most ethical army in the world, and all the gaslighting and all the it's because Hamas is embedding them and using them as human shields and all that narrative. Well, now we get an IDF leak that shows 83% of civilians of the deaths, 83% are civilians. This was a classified Israeli military database that revealed this information. And obviously, they're just including the 53,000 that they've registered. And of those 53,000 Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza, only 8,900 of them have been identified as militants. So that is the 83% civilian. And we knew this all along. And we know the numbers are a lot higher. We know that Lancet did a study saying 400,000. We know that Trump said there were only 1.7 million Palestinians when before there were 2.3 million. We know that this is, and now slowly but surely, at the same time as Israel mass protests, at the same time as the cabinet being more fragile than ever, at the same time as recruiting reservists, which means you need the support of the Orthodox Jews within Israel that don't want to be a part of the IDF. All of this can lead to destabilization of Israel and turning it into an absolute pariah state for distressed acquisition. And I think led by the GCC and what's being negotiated by BlackRock, as I covered last week. So we don't even have the real data, but that's the leaked data. And meanwhile, we see the GCC basically preparing for what I consider to be the US decolonization and deals with BlackRock that locks in the financial industrial complex into peace. But there's still far to go. We are still being told that there is a mass, they're going to be going back to the invasion and occupation in Gaza. They're going to be concentrating them into Rafah. And so those implied negotiations are still happening as well. Saudi Arabia and Syria, they basically announced their plan to do joint investment fund to boost they called it sustainable growth and development. They signed an investment promotion and protection agreement to support and safeguard cross-border investments at the same time as Saudi saying will pay off the World Bank debt. So that is US World Bank exit, GCC takeover, with Israel occupying certain territory, while Israel, which is a proxy for the proof of weapons network, military industrial complex, while US fraction of the financial industrial complex is negotiating terms via Trump. Saudi Arabia also Tabawul is also preparing for a Damascus stock exchange. So basically, Saudi Arabia is going to be supporting Damascus in a stock exchange launch in order to rebuild. Now, who's going to be the primary investor? Of course, it will be GCC regions that will then do those flotations. What does flotation means? It means financialization and securitization, which is probably where BlackRock comes in as well. So this partnership follows a $6.4 billion deal from the recent Saudi delegation visit to Syria. Egypt has begun a training of 5,000 Palestinians, allegedly, and this is police officers, which is in coordination with Jordan, and they're being trained as part of an effort to address the security vacuum within the Gaza Strip. And so that is according to Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Adaleti. Sorry if I got that name wrong. So take it with a pinch of salt. This can either be what Egypt wants you to see to control much of the civil unrest, or it can be a preparation and movement towards the eventual deal with Jordan, Egypt, and the GCC being involved in the rebuild. Jordan reinstates mandatory military service for the first time in 33 years. This may be a flex, maybe to appease the people, but this is the Jordanian state-owned outfit, Petra News, that reported that. So take it with a pinch of salt, and that was what the agency report. King Abdullah II, that member went through the Trump humiliation ritual, and he appeased Trump by saying we'll be taking on some of the children, which they were already doing when they are in critical conditions. If you've been watching some of the footage of the amputations, the famine, the starvations, I watched just before this like a documentary on some of the journalists while they're being massacred, the ones that are left over that are able to cover some of this. It is devastating. It is going to be, when this is connected, I don't see how Israel recovers from this or functions again. There may be some state deals done, but I don't see any recovery. This is full pariah state. And US, when it comes to the September meetings where everyone is going to recognize Palestinian except for US, either that's going to lead to announcements or extreme isolation of US and extreme embarrassment and the dismantling of all international law as a result of this as well. So yeah, King Abdullah announced that decision. And so now you have to do mandatory service in Jordan. This was abolished in 1992, and this was shortly after the signing of the peace agreement with Israel, where Israel invaded land, vassalized Jordan, agreed that it would take in Palestinians for relocation and ethnic cleansing, and then gave back some of the land, which was related to Egypt and Jordan having Gaza and West Bank, that now being reoccupied and renegotiated as they start to defy the colonization forces and the IMF by aligning with the GCC as a result of the alignment with BRICS based upon China normalizing between Saudi Arabia and Iran as the general thing. Petra News Agency reports the election itself was that the election itself was aimed at Israel because Israel talked about, for the very first time, by Netanyahu, the Greater Israel Project, which has traditionally been said that's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. But Zionism have always wanted the additional land as the ideological promise. And there was an announcement of mass settler expansion into the Greater Israel Project and expansion into the West Bank. This is turning Israel into the most hated country in the world, a complete pariah state. And because of that, we had further announcements from the Norwegian Wealth Fund that on top of the 11 investments through the other fund, the largest one in the world, Norway is going to be cutting 6 firms that were linked with occupied territories in the West Bank and illegal settlements. Any investments in Israel are now down to 38 firms. That's worth $1.86 billion that they're reducing from the 61 that they had in June. So they're divesting. There are more sanctions. There are more boycotts from individuals. And then there are the neighbors are investing to occupy, own, and do based upon vassalization contracts as well. Contracts with 3 Israeli asset managers were also cut from managing the funds with the Norwegian fund. And there was an announcement from Hamas that they have accepted the new Gaza ceasefire proposal, which leads to Hamas not being a part of leadership, full return of hostages, negotiations with the Palestinian hostages, and that was completely moderated by Egypt and Qatar. And despite that, Israel is preparing for another ground invasion amid these massive, large protests in Israel to prevent the ground invasion as well. And US basically says that all 55 million visas, this is part of the gaslighting that's happening in the US. So all 55 visas of immigrants, legal immigrants in America, are now under review, but they're being under review for any anti-Israel protesters. So I see this as the technical industrial complex making the mass civil unrest campaigns, profiting with the financial industrial complex, and then a resistance from the military industrial complex, which historically has been aligned with Zionism and that type of struggle, and the portfolio management from the proof of weapons network going through as well. I think it's also worth pointing out, while all of these immigration narratives are being pointed out, that because birth rates in the West are at historic all-time lows, suicide rates are at all-time highs, drug addiction is at all-time highs, wealth inequality is at its extreme rates. Because of all of that, the only solution to the demographic issue is either increase the birth rates, which are not on that trend, or have more immigrants. And so because the immigrants are being tackled, open borders, mass deportations, that will strategically weaken both US, UK, EU, Israel further as well, which will push further vassalization into the proof of weapons network, but in the guise of a nationalist agenda that adheres to those type of nationalist narratives. And you can connect it to crime. Crime can then lead to surveillance state, police state, and that other benefit to the technical industrial complex. And so more civil unrest campaigns, the better. So this is the multipolar world order that I've been describing. This is everything that I think you need to know about what's happening this week in geopolitics. So as a review, this episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 94, this was, is the Fed dead? In part one, we covered the Syrian central attitude towards Bitcoin. We covered the strategy centralization of Bitcoin into Wall Street financial products and fighting back with self-custody, as well as everything else that happened this week in Bitcoin. In part two, we covered the updates on the Fed ending, fiscal dominance, any tools that monetarism still has, the stablecoin integration, the trend. I think we're still here. Azad, can you still hear me?
Yep. Still
live. Oh, cool. All right, cool. We're still live. Sorry, I thought we had another blackout. We're wrapping up right now. In part three, we covered everything that happened this week in geopolitics with a particular focus on the Putin and Trump meeting and the subsequent Zelensky European Union meeting, and the continued vassalization project, and why I believe this doesn't lead to peace because of the connection to the Middle Eastern forces, and what we're seeing in the pariah Israel state, isolation of America, and how that connects to the wider geopolitical issues with some of the numbers and following the money behind it. So always remember, while this is sometimes very dark, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Stay up to date by subscribing to my channel, sharing this, putting a comment. We're over 101,000 subscribers, heading for 102,000. Hopefully we can get there by the end of this video. If you like to listen to this on podcast, so you can download it and break it up into bits, then I'm on, look up Bitcoin Hard Talk on Apple Podcast and Spotify. In case we get banned from YouTube, I thought we were actually taken down by YouTube in live today, but we had to do a rebuild. We were live the whole time on Rumble, so follow me over there. And remember to get your Bitcoin in self-custody guide, become a member of the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal completely free over on simondixon.com. And hopefully I'll put a link in the description to the self-custody blog, as well as you being able to head over to simondixon.com, go to the blog section, type in custody, and you will find that blog as well. So please do like, please do share, please do subscribe. We did a little experiment just before we close up where I did an interview on George Gammon's channel that has 16,000 subscribers, and over 120,000 people viewed the exact same video that we uploaded to my channel with over 100,000 subscribers. And I think we got 20,000 views, and that was based upon our audience and our shares only. So YouTube is not ranking because they don't want this message to get out. So I rely upon you to do that. So please do share. I read all comments. I'll try and reply to them as well. And let me know what you would like to see. That's going to be everything for Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 94. Is the Fed dead? As we transition